Hi, I'm Linda Mal, and welcome to Art This Week. On this week's episode, we visit the Blanton Museum of Art, and our interviewer, Kay Yoland, speaks with curator Evan Garza about the exhibition, Come As You Are, Art of the 1990s. Now for Art This Week.
I thought we would start off with just an overview of the main themes that we're looking at in
Sure.
the show and what an audience member could expect from walking through.
Sure. Come As You Are, Art of the 1990s focuses exclusively on emerging art from the period. Artists who first became a part of the art historical discourse during the 1990s and to some degree the very late 80s. The exhibition includes work that was made between the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 and September 11th in 2001. So that's the period that we're looking at. And of course, I think we can all agree that there are an infinite number of points of entry into and out of the 1990s, depending on personal experience and politics and race and class. Those are all issues that were at stake and which come up quite frequently in the exhibition. But the show is really grouped around three main umbrella themes. The identity politics debates that arose in the early 1990s, spawned in large part by events like the AIDS crisis, which began in the 1980s. Then also globalization, which of course had a profound effect on how art was distributed and seen, and had a great deal of effect on the economy, globalization. And then lastly, the digital revolution and the birth of the internet. And that takes place sort of like the mid to late 90s, at least on a cultural level, really starting in the mid 1990s, and then really having a profound effect on late 90s culture, early 2000s.
I mean, you've referenced already the fall of the Berlin Wall and the reunification of East and West Berlin in 1990. We've also got the apartheid in South Africa that starts to shift.
Correct.
Mandela coming out of prison after 27 years.
Right. Rodney King in 1992, the LA riots.
So these things are obviously influencing these artists. Do you think that they're a more politicized group than previously? Or do you think this is just a very specific time that for us to look back on?
That's a great question. And it comes up quite frequently in the study of work from this period. For example, the 1993 Whitney Biennial is sort of an incredibly significant moment during this time, and there are a number of artists in the exhibition that were included in the 93 Biennial. That exhibition was really critically lauded for a number of reasons, but largely because the Whitney had never shown so many women and persons of color and LGBT artists previously. There had really not been a precedent for such a diverse biennial. And so the critical discourse really became about whether the museum was seeking out these artists for their marginalization or because of some larger, greater contribution to the art world as a whole.
So is it a curatorial decision?
Correct.
Or is it actually the artists are suddenly rising?
Right, that's right. And I don't know if those questions have ever really been answered, quite frankly. If you think about the identity politics debates, which really make up such an incredible number of works in the exhibition dealing with that subject matter. We're talking about artists in the early and mid 90s who were dealing with a very racist American history. But I think what was the most radical aspect about works that deal with identity politics is the notion of identity as a radical form of social change, or essentially as a catalyst for identity as a catalyst for social change. We saw that in the LA riots. We see this in the work that was produced during the AIDS crisis. So whether it was a very specific time or whether these were simply things that artists really felt needed to be part of the discourse, they became very confrontational on how that work was produced. I think in a manner that really set up the precedent for contemporary art making now.
When we're looking at the LGBTQ rights now, in that time in the 90s, it was still, homosexuality, there was still on the cusp of being a mental disorder, the idea of rights of those groups to be understood as having partnerships, and now we have...
No, Anita Bryant was on television telling people that we need to figure out a way to get rid of these homosexuals. Let's not dance around it. It was very difficult. It was a very different time. The social conditions were much different. You were much more likely to be killed in the street than for someone to hand a marriage license over to you with no questions asked.
And even in 1998, we have Matthew Shepard,
That's
who
right.
at 21 was
That's
being
right.
tortured and
I always forget
killed.
that that's 98. It feels like it's so much earlier than that.
I mean, looking back, this is relevant to today because we're still sorting through these problems, maybe not with such vile violence, but
Right.
still the gay marriage is still on the table, and
Sure.
they're still fighting. And then if we look at what's going on with US and Europe's involvement in the Middle East,
Sure.
and we had Nixon, and then we had Bush and their involvement in Kuwait. So there's that history, the World
Right.
Trade Center being first attacked in the 90s, and then you have 2001, and also then the race riots. So I'm wondering if you can if you were to say to viewers, why should you come see this show?
Sure. The exhibition begins with a room devoted exclusively to artists dealing with AIDS and the AIDS crisis. Collectives like Grand Fury, who did a project sponsored by Creative Time in 1989, 1990. The campaign was called Kissing Doesn't Kill. What they produced was essentially an advertising campaign whose purpose was to disseminate useful information about the spread of HIV/AIDS. And so the context is that at the time, the notion was that you were susceptible to contracting HIV/AIDS by kissing someone or by sitting on the same toilet seat or using a water fountain. The additional context there is that the Reagan administration did not acknowledge that AIDS was either a disease or a crisis until over 25,000 people had already died from the disease.
And he actually had to apologize, I think.
He did later after Bush became president.
It was too late.
It was, exactly. It was far too late. So the work by Grand Fury is modeled after United Colors of Benetton ad, which of course reflects a very corporate image, and the purpose for that was not only so that the ad would seem recognizable, but that it would also seem approachable. Those Benetton ads at the time were filled with multiracial models and colorful sweaters, and so the billboard that's featured in the exhibition really gets to the core of that visual identity of United Colors of Benetton, and makes the claim that kissing doesn't kill, which essentially is the argument that a form of the contemporary argument that we see now, which is that love wins. We constantly see this in the present day, and so this is a
precursor to that.
That's absolutely right. But it was also designed to be very functional. It was meant to be informative, and then the other reason is that it was meant to show LGBT persons and interracial couples as being loving, as being beautiful and normal. Right, and the whole notion of seeing LGBT persons with dignity was really quite radical at the time.
Mm-hmm. So I guess for people coming here who have lived through the 90s or born in the 90s, this gives them an understanding of where our rights now have come from, what people have fought for, or where we still need to fight to continue so that we don't go back into some previous position of inequality.
Yeah, I think there are a number of points of entry into the show. Mm-hmm. As I mentioned, it's impossible to take to come out of the 90s with just one perspective. Mm-hmm. I think that there's a cultural expectation that the 90s was all about grunge and. But this was the major birth of hip hop in the 90s, mm-hmm. and it was absolutely when hip hop transformed into something, a movement that just came out of Harlem into something that really captured the identity of the entire country. So I've taught this works from this exhibition to a lot of students over the course of the last several weeks, many of whom were in diapers in 1998 when Matthew Shepard was killed, or who don't remember the fall of the Twin Towers. And so what they end up taking out of the work is seeing the kind of art making precedents that began in the 1990s that really continue to the present day. I mean, if you take for example, a third wave feminism, which art historians generally attribute to late 80s, early 90s, and the fact that we still consider, in 2016, we still consider ourselves within the third wave of feminism. I mean, I think that alone, the notion that, the dialogue that was started by women and by feminists. And
Judith Butler.
Judith Butler, precisely. There are works by Beverly Sims, and I would really argue that the Cheryl Donegan video works that we've added to this conversation also very much get at the core of feminist ideals in the early 90s, and a very DIY production aesthetic, and low cost, high impact. And that's also very much the case with Alex Bagg. And Alex's work, Untitled, Fall '95, it was really a landmark work in the 90s, in my opinion. I really feel like her work and the work of Nikki S. Their works are really central, I think, to 90s art making ideals. Notions of performing gender, performing race, performing identity. And I think those notions are not lost on young people that come through the exhibition. I mean, that work by Alex Bagg completely prefigures YouTube culture. It was made 1 or 2 years after the birth of MTV's The Real World. So the notion of direct-to-camera monologues was a completely newfangled idea in terms of media, and now it's completely normal. Yeah, it's the standard.
So art as social change and advocacy is definitely kind of something that we can observe here in the work, but also how what they're fighting for could still be fought for, as you say, like this third wave feminism still existing in a contemporary setting.
Yeah, I mean, and let's also talk about race. I mean, the fact that the Voting Rights Act was dismantled in 2012, so even, whether we're talking about LGBT issues, whether we're talking about women, whether we're talking about people of color, these things are still very much in the foreground of the American consciousness.
Maybe we can hone in on a couple of the artists now. Donald Moffett as well is in that room called the White House.
Right.
Maybe you can just tell us a bit more about
Sure.
that, and also of, I guess, Felix Gonzalez's piece with the sweets, which is an interactive piece, actually, which might be interesting.
That's right. So Donald Moffett, who's a native of San Antonio, it was one of the founding members of Grand Fury, which was an agitprop artist collective working in New York from about 1988 to about 1995. And then around 1989, 1990, Donald begins exhibiting his own solo exhibitions. So that work, it's a lightbox, and it comes from a series of lightbox works, which each ask the viewer to contact their state or congressional or senatorial officials, and that the phone number that's on the work is a fully functioning number. You can call it right now, and you can get an operator at the White House. Still, yes,
wow.
Yes. So you could also consider that work an interactive work, depending on how far you'd like to go.
Did he ever think of installing, or the gallery think of installing a phone next to it? Like, could you imagine if you just constantly
I never
calls?
thought of asking Donald that. I'll have to ask him what he thinks about that.
I mean, I guess with cell phones now, anybody could just stand in front of it and call up.
That's absolutely right. And then I'm sure that would be his answer too. And then the work by Felix Gonzalez Torres is called Untitled Placebo. And Felix is arguably the most important artist of the 1990s. Felix's works have always been untitled.
Why is that?
The reason, in my opinion, or my understanding of the work and Felix's practice, is that he didn't want the viewer to be coerced in one direction or another. He didn't want the work to be defined by any one thing. Mm-hmm. He did, to be candid, he didn't want the work to be defined by AIDS or by the AIDS crisis. And in a way, because the work is so marked by loss invariably and conversely, it's also marked by this incredible acknowledgement of life. So the candy work that we feature in the exhibition, Untitled Placebo, is an untitled work, but then there's this kind of contextual warmer that's placed, within parentheses. And so the term placebo, of course, refers to, a pill that has a psychological benefit rather than a physiological one. And it really starts to beg the question, okay, put yourself back in the 1990s when retroviral medications were starting to be tested, and what good does a placebo do for someone who has HIV/AIDS? It really becomes a kind of ethical question about
who's got the time to be doing that when you're
right,
dying.
That's correct. And these people really were dying at an alarming rate. So the work, the viewer has the option of taking a piece or not. And it's there are those little things that Felix does with the work that are really brilliant. Felix's practice really comes out of conceptual art practices, blending those conceptual art traditions with subject matter that was incredibly personal to Felix, but then also very, very personal, for the culture at large in the 1990s. He was very political as an individual, but as an artist, the work was always left kind of wide open.
Well, let's move on just because there's so many artists to look at. I'm thinking maybe we can, with some reference to Kara Walker behind us,
sure.
We could also have a look at Fred Wilson, a portrait of Sam, and also if we can discuss Vic Muniz's work that looks at the sugar plantations, who's a Brazilian artist, and the kind of reference to African Americans and slavery,
That's right.
which Kara Walker in her 18th century style silhouettes is also referencing.
Yeah, and the way that Vic Muniz has approached that is really genius. And the works, the sugar portraits that are a part of the exhibition, those were the first works of Vic Muniz that I was ever familiar with. So he visited St. Kitts Island in the Caribbean and was really taken by the children there. And so he's made essentially sugar drawings of 3 of those kids. It's white sugar on black paper. And they're executed masterfully. So there is this immediate connotation with the kind of sweetness of youth, as I've referred to it previously. But then he was also really surprised to see how different their family members were in terms of their demeanor and do
you mean how they're altered through life, through the tragedies, or?
No, just that they work in the sugar plantations and the sugar factories in St. Kitts. So there was this marked difference between these innocent kids who were still quite young and quite joyful and innocent, and then their parents who had a very real understanding of their place within a larger, global economy. The context here is that Muniz is making these works in the mid to late 90s, 1997, if I'm not mistaken, and the way that the works are used in the exhibition not only is to approach notions of identity, but also contributing to a larger conversation about the nature of globalization. So the context here is that the parents and grandparents of those kids that are working in the sugar factories don't have the kind of financial reward of that work that, say, a white corporate CEO might receive from simply being the leader of an organization that owns those sugar factories in St. Kitts. So it's not the people of St. Kitts that financially benefit from the sale of that sugar. It's countries like England and the United States that have that fund those that own those sugar factories. So it's a very sweet, unfortunately, it's a very sweet statement about how the global economy functions, who benefits from that global economy. Is it persons of color? In this case, absolutely not. But it also touches on this larger social framework in the Caribbean, and gets to this notion of how third world countries contribute to first world needs. And I think it makes a very clear and a very poetic statement about how those roles play out and who benefits from that. Fred Wilson was a major figure in this practice of identity politics, but also very much a part of institutional critique. Which
he looks at through these stereotypes or archetypes.
That's right. So he's looking at institutional critique through this lens of identity politics. So this work, portrait of the Seattle Art Museum, portrait of Sam, they're all individual photographs of small objects from the Seattle Art Museum's collection. And then there's vinyl text on the wall above it that says Europeans, and they're all photos of objects that had been attributed to Europeans in some way. But each of the figures themselves really resemble a different racial ethnicity. They do look quite diverse, but then they've all been placed under this rubric, right? Exactly, they've all been placed into a very rigid category for how they are to be defined. And then not only that, regardless of how much they might resemble an individual of color, they've been placed under this European
ownership.
Banner. Right,
Yeah.
Correct.
So would you say, as you move through the show, that we move into different ideas of identity politics?
I agree. Yeah, I would say that's a pretty accurate way of thinking about the show. And by the end of the exhibition, in the final section, there are an incredible number of internet artworks and digital works. What I find really significant is that the first commercial availability of the internet is around 1992, 93. But then it really becomes a much more commercially available dial-up in around 1994, 95. And the way that identity is approached by artists in the exhibition after that, I think has something to do with how culturally we began to think about identity after the internet. So if you think of someone like Nikki S, who is a Korean artist, South Korean artist who was working in the United States during the 1990s, Seoul-based artist, and she was performing gender and performing identity through a series of projects that in which she would portray some member of some American group. So the Ohio Project, she...
That one particularly interesting.
Yeah, she's in a trailer with a guy who's got a shotgun. She's sort of blonde and there's a Confederate flag behind her. The Hispanic Project, which she did in Spanish Harlem in New York, where she's got big door knocker earrings that say Latina, and the Punk Project, which she did on St. Mark's Place in the East Village. And in each of those, she's taken some American stereotype and is really performing that identity. And I think what's worth mentioning is that what's happening culturally at the same time is that for the first time, people are able to go and create an identity that only exists online, that only exists in this digital realm.
Do you mean in the sense of something that we get with Second Life? Or do you mean
sort of?
But this is the 90s. I think this is it's before Second Life.
It is, yes.
Talking
but
more...
you could log into a chat room, or you could create, a username on AOL Instant Messenger, or
pretend to be something.
And you could be anyone. So this notion of performing identity is not just something that Nikki S. Lee was doing as an artist, but it's also something that was taking place culturally. To
what extent are we talking about? Sorry to kind of try to
Yeah.
really unpack this, because I'm not so aware of actually how this was playing out. Are we talking about people, men being women and women being men on the internet, or a white person posing as a black person, or vice versa? Is it that kind of clear-cut performing something else is what you think it might be, or is it a little bit more...
I just mean that because of the internet, there were freedoms associated with identity that had not been prevalent culturally before. So the sense that I, as a 16-year-old kid in '96, could log on to an AOL chat and pretend to be a 6-foot, blonde-haired, blue-eyed version of myself based on either my own personal shame or my own interest in that identity, and then log
or being
off.
accepted by a group.
Right, correct. What I'm trying to do is simply make comparisons between the notion of performing identity in Nikki S. Lee's work and the notion that around this time the internet was affording people the kind of freedoms associated with identity that we take for granted now in a, an individual-based, digital social media culture. And I think that those notions are also really at work in Alex Bagg's video work as well, wherein she performs as several different characters. And in other videos that were produced by Bagg during this time, she's playing men, she's playing women, she's playing, in this case, she's playing a college student at SVA, and she's playing a anti-capitalist, feminist phone sex operator, and she's performing as, London shop girls who moonlight as, punk rock band members, and she's able to take all of those identities and perform each one of them. And I think the notion of identity is so central to art making in the 1990s. It really starts to transform, in the mid to late 90s. There's a whole can of worms begins to open because of the birth of the internet, and all those limitless possibilities have really been activated really ever since then.
Especially with the Ohio project, I was trying to work out, does she actually get to become friends with this man?
Right.
And is it a
It's
position
tricky.
where they pay, they're
Right.
paid for 10 minutes to pose in a shot in the way that we see with Instagram?
I don't know the degree to which they were paid, and my understanding is that, there was a piece that was written for Vice recently by one of the guys who's in the Punk Project photograph, and he mentions that they used to see this girl around at shows and stuff, and they thought she was a Japanese punk because her style was so different from all the street punk styles in the East Village. So they saw her on St. Mark's one afternoon, and she said, "Hey, do you mind if I take a photo with you guys?" So the notion of the degree to which she was really a part of those communities, I think, is really up for grabs. But I think, in my opinion, I think that makes the work even stronger because it really does get at the core of this idea of cultural tourism.
And belonging as well. I mean,
Absolutely.
It has two sides.
But also, also because the work is really about examining the extent to which the exterior of oneself is meant to be in some way a reflection of the interior of the self.
Mm-hmm.
And so, to what degree do your garments and your grooming, to what degree do those identify you, or to what degree does that have to do with your identity as an individual? Mm-hmm. Those are really the questions that are being asked.
Excellent. Well, I hope that lots more people come and see the show before it ends. And thank you so much for spending time with me today.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
We want to thank Evan for speaking with us. For more information on the exhibition, go to blantonmuseum.org. That's it for Art This Week. Thanks for watching.
I still got your Polaroid.